So you're here because you want to really get to grips with something, yeah.
Could be prepping for a meeting or maybe just finally figuring out a topic that's always, sparked your interest.
Exactly. You want that core understanding, the real substance, but without uh, getting bogged down in endless detail.
Think of this as your fast track to really knowing what you're talking about.
Today, we're diving into something fascinating. Self-awareness and self-consciousness. Two ideas that get mixed up all the time.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at it from all sorts of angles. Everything from comments on Reddit to proper scientific studies, even a bit of philosophy.
Our mission really is to pull out the key differences, maybe some surprising bits, and give you stuff you can actually use. Practical insights for your life, your work.
You want those aha moments, but without the headache of information overload.
Definitely. And our jumping off point is actually a question someone asked on Reddit. Super simple, but it gets right to it.
What was it again?
Just, can self-aware and self-conscious be used interchangeably?
Ah, right. Seems basic, but as we'll see, unpacking that really opens up a lot about how we see ourselves.
Okay, so let's tackle that. There was this user, the Arch-Chancellor, who gave some starting definitions.
Yeah, what did they say?
They suggested self-aware is like focusing inward on your actions, thoughts, feelings, and checking them against your own internal compass, your standards.
Okay, an internal check-in. And self-conscious.
That was defined more as being excessively aware of yourself, like worrying too much about how you look or what others think, and undue awareness was the phrase used.
Right, that feeling of being under a microscope.
But then another user, Roswell, added some really good points. They kind of agreed self-awareness feels broader.
How so?
Well, Roswell mentioned that self-consciousness often feels uncomfortable, almost negative, like you're judging yourself harshly. And they linked it directly to feeling watched, judged, basically, embarrassment.
That makes sense. It often has that social anxiety flavor to it.
Yeah. And what was really interesting is that Roswell also hinted that self-awareness could go even deeper.
Deeper how?
Like maybe it includes the fundamental realization that you are a separate self, a distinct individual in the universe.
Whoa, okay. Getting a bit philosophical there.
Yeah, maybe a bit. But it just shows how broad self-awareness can be, that basic sense of me.
Well, just based on those Reddit comments, the first takeaway is clear, isn't it?
Yeah. They're related, both involve focusing on yourself, but they're definitely not the same thing in everyday talk, not interchangeable.
Right. And that leads us nicely into a more, shall we say, formal psychological idea. Objective self-awareness theory. Duvall and Wickland, back in '72.
Objective self-awareness theory. Okay, break that down for us. What's the core idea?
Well, basically, it's when your attention shifts inward. Instead of looking out at the world, you turn the focus onto yourself. You become the object of your own attention.
Ah, okay, so you start looking at yourself.
Exactly. And the theory says when that happens, you automatically start comparing yourself to your internal standards, your values, goals, beliefs, that sort of thing.
It's like holding up a mirror to yourself, psychologically speaking.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And they contrasted this with what they called subjective self-awareness.
Which is?
That's just our normal state, right? Attention focused outward, experiencing the world, being the subject, doing the perceiving.
Now, I seem to remember the initial idea was that this objective self-awareness wasn't always fun.
Yeah, that was the early thinking. The idea was when you look inward, you're probably going to spot ways you fall short of your ideals, right? Discrepancies. And noticing those gaps would feel bad, lead to negative feelings.
Makes sense. We don't always like seeing where we miss the mark.
But later research sort of nuanced that. It found, well, if you feel like you are meeting your standards, then looking inward can actually feel good. It reinforces positive feelings.
Okay, so it depends on whether you like what you see in that internal mirror.
Pretty much.
So what happens when you do see those gaps, those discrepancies?
The theory suggests two main paths you might take. First, you might feel motivated to change something about yourself, your behavior, maybe your attitude to close that gap and meet the standard.
Okay, so change yourself. What's the other option?
Avoidance. You might try to steer clear of things, situations, thoughts, even mirrors sometimes, that make you focus on yourself and trigger that uncomfortable comparison.
Ah, the old head in the sand technique. Very human.
Isn't it just?
But what makes someone choose one path over the other? Change versus avoidance.
Ah, this is where it gets interesting. It comes down to expectancies. When you notice that gap, you kind of subconsciously assess, can I actually fix this? Can I realistically meet this standard?
Right. Like, do I think I can actually succeed?
Exactly. If you think, yeah, I can probably bridge this gap,
Mm.
you're more likely to try and change. But if your expectation is low, if you think, nah, I'm probably not going to manage that, then avoidance looks much more appealing.
It's like a quick internal bet on yourself.
Sort of, yeah. And there's another layer, attributions. When there's a discrepancy, you start thinking about why.
Why am I falling short?
Right. Is it something about me? Lack of effort, maybe? Or are my standards just way too high? Or maybe it's outside factors.
And how you answer that why question influences what you do next.
Absolutely. If you think it's down to you and you believe you can change back to those expectancies, you might try harder. If you blame external factors or think change isn't likely, you might just try to avoid thinking about it, or maybe even question the standard itself.
Okay, that makes sense. But you said self-focus isn't always about finding flaws, right?
Definitely not. Think about success. If you succeed at something while you're in that self-aware state, you're more likely to credit your skills, your effort.
Ah, so it boosts the ego.
It can significantly boost self-esteem, yeah.
Yeah.
That feeling of, wow, I did that, gets amplified.
Nice. But what about failure? How does that interact with whether you think you can improve?
It's crucial. If you fail, take responsibility internally, my fault, and believe you can do better next time, you'll likely try to change.
Makes sense. Learn from mistakes.
But if you fail, blame something external, the test was unfair, and you don't really see how you could improve anyway, then you're probably going to try and avoid that self-focus. Avoid reminders of the failure.
Okay. Now, you mentioned maybe changing the standards. That sounds a bit like letting yourself off the hook.
It can look like that, and it's a really fascinating part of the theory. It suggests people might actually adjust their internal standards to match what they did, especially if they're self-focused after a failure.
Really? Like lowering the bar afterwards?
Kind of. There's some interesting research on what they call moral hypocrisy.
Ooh, tell me about that.
Well, some studies suggested that if a particular moral standard isn't like front and center in someone's mind at that moment and they're feeling self-aware, they might subtly shift their judgment of that standard to make their own self-serving actions seem okay.
Wow. So basically, rationalizing by tweaking the rules slightly after the fact.
It looks a bit like that, yeah. It's like saying, well, maybe that rule isn't always the most important thing. It shows how flexible our standards can sometimes be, especially when our self-image is on the line.
That's,
Yeah,
yeah, a bit unsettling, but you can see how it happens. So whether we're actively thinking about the standard makes a difference.
huge difference. There was this study with a copying task. People failed, right? Then, some had their attention drawn specifically to the performance standard they'd failed to meet.
And what happened?
Those people were more likely to rate the standard negatively, even say they wanted to change it. It's like when the failure and the standard are both brightly lit in your awareness, the standard itself can become the target for adjustment.
So the big picture from this theory is self-awareness can push us to change ourselves, or it can lead us to kind of rearrange our internal goalposts to feel better.
That's a really good summary of the tension, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the state of being self-aware. But how do psychologists actually, measure this tendency in people? Is it a trait?
Good question. That brings us to dispositional self-awareness, basically. How much individuals tend to focus on themselves as a general personality characteristic.
Right. Some people are just more introspective than others.
Exactly, but it's not one single thing. Psychologists look at it in different ways, things like insight, reflection, even rumination, or mindfulness.
So different flavors of self-focus.
Yeah, and this is crucial. The link between being self-aware and feeling good, your well-being, it really depends on which flavor you're talking about. It's not always straightforwardly positive.
How so? Give me an example.
Okay, take the self-reflection and insight scale, the SRIS. It separates self-reflection, which is just sort of paying attention to and evaluating your inner stuff, from insight, which is the clarity of understanding you have about it all.
Okay, reflecting versus understanding.
Right. And they found insight, that clear understanding is generally linked with better well-being, being more mentally flexible. But self-reflection on its own, that was linked to higher anxiety,
Oh.
but also weirdly lower depression.
Lower depression, that seems odd with higher anxiety.
It does. That's what they call the self-absorption paradox. Focusing on yourself can lead to deeper understanding, which is good, but it can also sometimes increase distress or anxiety. So just being self-focused isn't the whole story. It's about the quality of that focus understanding versus just dwelling or worrying,
Okay, so insight good, just reflecting. Mixed bag.
pretty much. Then there's another tool, the Self-Awareness Outcomes Questionnaire, or SAOQ. This came about by talking to therapists, person-centered CBT folks, about what actually happens when people become more self-aware. What are the results?
Ah, looking at the consequences. What did they find? What are the outcomes?
They identified four main factors.
Right.
First, reflective self-development learning and growing from looking inward. That's generally seen as positive.
Makes sense. Growth.
Second, acceptance, being okay with yourself, flaws and all. Also beneficial.
Self-acceptance now.
Third, proactivity. Self-awareness driving you to take action, especially noticeable at work. Also good.
Taking initiative.
But fourth, emotional costs. This captures the potential downsides, the difficult feelings, the struggle that can sometimes come with digging deep into yourself.
Right. It's not always easy looking inward. So this SAOQ tries to capture both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's really telling is how different types of self-focus predict these outcomes.
Like how?
Well, self-reflection and insight, like from the SRIS, they tend to predict the good stuff, the development, the acceptance. But rumination, getting stuck chewing over negative thoughts,
Yeah, we all know that one.
that predicts fewer benefits and higher emotional costs. No surprise there, really.
Right. And mindfulness.
Mindfulness predicted more proactivity, which is interesting, but also sometimes higher emotional costs.
Higher costs even with mindfulness. Why?
Well, think about it. Mindfulness can make you aware of uncomfortable feelings or thoughts you might have been avoiding. So while it has benefits, it's not necessarily always comfortable.
Good point. It shines a light everywhere, even the dusty corners.
Exactly. And they did a study using this SAOQ with different groups, therapists, therapy students, HR people, business students.
Did they score differently?
They did, kind of as you'd expect. The therapy students reported higher emotional costs, maybe because they were in training, doing a lot of intense self-examination.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Whereas the experienced therapists reported more reflective self-development and proactivity. It suggests maybe experience helps you navigate those costs and focus on the growth aspects.
So the takeaway here is, think about what kind of self-awareness you're cultivating and what the potential effects, good and bad, might be.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, this psychological perspective is really rich. But what about the brain? What's physically happening up there when we're being self-aware?
Ah, yes, the neuroscience angle. It adds another really important piece to the puzzle. Tools like fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, have been absolutely key.
Right, the brain scanners. They let us see which parts are active.
Exactly. So when we're retrieving self-knowledge, thinking about our traits, memories about ourselves, certain areas consistently light up, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex.
Okay, front and middle-ish.
And the medial posterior parietal cortex, sort of top-back middle region.
Got it. And what about actually reflecting on ourselves, thinking about our thoughts?
That seems to involve a network, included the posterior cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and again, that medial prefrontal cortex is pretty central. Oh, and the insular cortex also pops up, especially for that feeling of, this is relevant to me, self-reference.
Wow. It's kind of amazing that these abstract ideas have specific locations or networks in the brain. What about our physical selves, that feeling of being in our body?
Yeah, embodiment. Super important for our sense of self. Key players there seem to be the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ.
TPJ.
Okay, which helps integrate sensory info and tell self from other. And also the extracontustriate body area, which processes images of body parts. They work together to give us that sense of, this is my body.
So brain regions for knowing about ourselves, reflecting on ourselves, and feeling in our bodies. Cool. Now, I know different cultures view the self differently, right? Individualistic versus collectivistic. Does that show up in the brain?
It seems like it might. Some fMRI studies suggest that the medial prefrontal cortex activates differently depending on whether someone has a more independent view of self versus a more interdependent group-focused view.
Seriously. So culture might actually shape brain activity related to the self.
The evidence points that way, yeah.
Yeah.
It suggests a neural basis for these different self-construals.
That's wild. And what if these brain areas get damaged? Like after a stroke?
Yeah, unfortunately, things like strokes can impact self-perception. Sometimes people report feeling more negatively about themselves afterwards.
And does this change as we age? Is a kid's self-aware brain different from an adult's?
It seems so. There are developmental changes. Studies show differences, particularly in prefrontal cortex activity related to self-knowledge, between children and adults. It really suggests our neural map of self isn't static. It develops and changes over our lifespan.
Which leads perfectly into development. So we're not born self-aware. It grows over time.
Exactly. It unfolds gradually. A developmental psychologist named Philippe Rochat proposed 5 levels in early childhood.
5 levels. Okay, walk me through them briefly.
Starts with level 0, basically confusion. The baby doesn't really distinguish self from environment. Then level 1, differentiation, starting to sense their own body's movements. Level 2, situation, understanding their body in relation to other things.
Okay.
Level 3 is identification. This is the big one. Recognizing themselves in a mirror, usually around 18-24 months.
The mirror test. Well, yeah.
Then level 4, permanence understanding. They exist continuously over time.
Yeah.
And finally, level 5, which he calls self-consciousness or meta-self-awareness. Yeah, understanding that not only are you aware of you, but other people are aware of you too. Seeing yourself from a third-person perspective, essentially.
Ah, okay. That understanding that others see you. That sounds like it connects back to our earlier definition of self-consciousness.
It does, doesn't it? Before that mirror stage, though, in infancy, there's this earlier first-person self-awareness developing, linking what they feel their body doing with what they see it doing.
Like seeing their hand move and feeling it move at the same time.
Exactly, that basic connection.
And then adolescence. What happens to self-awareness then?
Big changes. Teenagers become much more tuned in to their own emotions, how those emotions affect them, and crucially, how they come across to their peers. Their understanding of their inner world gets way more complex.
The angst years.
Well, yeah, but also the development of metacognition, thinking about their own thinking. And this is often when things like self-awareness training can really help, maybe with managing strong emotions like anger.
Right. Okay, so we've got the psychology, the brain bits, the development. Let's circle back. Self-awareness versus self-consciousness. Can we get a really clear final distinction now?
I think so. There's a helpful article, Understanding the Difference Between Self-Awareness and Consciousness, that frames it nicely. It talks about self-awareness as exploring your inner landscape.
Inner landscape. I like that.
Yeah. Understanding your thoughts, your beliefs, your emotions, your typical behaviors. It suggests things like psych tests are okay starting points. But real self-awareness needs deeper work journaling, maybe coaching or therapy. It's an active digging process.
So inward-focused understanding, that seems consistent.
Exactly. Recognizing your habitual thought patterns, seeing how your beliefs shape your reality. You know that phrase, we are living in the feeling of our thinking.
Yeah, Michael Neal.
Right. Self-awareness helps you see that connection.
And self-consciousness, then, in this framework.
That's still primarily about that focus on how others see you. Being overly concerned with external perception, often leading to that discomfort or anxiety we talked about.
So awareness, internal understanding focus. Consciousness, external perception focus. Is that too simple?
It's a good core distinction. The article also brings in consciousness with a capital C, almost.
As in broader than just self-awareness.
Yeah, more about interconnectedness, transcending the individual self, seeing yourself as part of a bigger whole, kind of a spiritual or philosophical angle, referencing thinkers like Sadhguru.
Okay, so self-awareness as the inward gaze, and this broader consciousness as more of an outward or maybe all-encompassing embrace.
That's the idea presented.
Yeah.
And they suggest its reciprocal deepening self-awareness can lead to broader consciousness, and vice versa.
This is all fascinating theory, but let's make it practical. For someone listening right now wanting to cultivate more self-awareness, what can they actually do?
Right. Actionable steps. That same article offers some really concrete suggestions. One simple one is daily breath work.
Just focusing on the breath?
Yeah, even for a few minutes. It helps anchor you in the present. Step away from the mental whirlwind. Meditation or similar practices also helps find that inner quiet and observe thoughts without getting swept away.
Okay, mindfulness-based stuff. Makes sense. What else?
Journaling. Huge recommendation there.
Yeah.
It's powerful for spotting patterns, thoughts, feelings, triggers. They even suggest a prompt. Think about a recent emotional experience. What set it off? What memories did it bring up? What stories were you telling yourself about it?
Digging into a specific event.
Yeah. And interestingly, they really recommend writing by hand.
Why handwriting?
Apparently, it slows you down, engages the brain differently, allows for deeper reflection than just typing.
I can see that. Worth trying. Any other tips?
2 more good ones. One is consciously reflecting on your impact. Like, how do you want to affect the people you interact with? Does your behavior match that intention?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Thinking about your effect on others.
Yeah. And finally, they suggest considering coaching or therapy not just for problems, but proactively. Like a mental workout for growth. deepening self-understanding.
So lots of practical tools people can explore. Now, we've been very human-centric. What about animals? Do other creatures have self-awareness?
Ah, yes, the animal question. It's super intriguing. The main tool used, as we touched on with kids, is the mirror self-recognition test.
Right, seeing if they recognize themselves. Which animals pass?
Well, the famous ones are the great apes, chimps, orangutans, gorillas, but also dolphins, elephants, and even surprisingly, Eurasian magpies.
Magpies. That seems unexpected. How does the test actually work for, say, a dolphin or an elephant?
It involves stages. First,
Mm.
they see if the animal treats the reflection like another animal's social responses. Then do they investigate the mirror itself.
Mm.
Then, crucially, do they start using the mirror to look at parts of their own body they can't normally see. The clincher is the mark test. You put a mark, like paint or a sticker, somewhere on their body they can only see in the mirror, like their forehead. If they see the mark in the mirror and then touch the mark on their own body,
Then they must realize the reflection is them.
that's the inference, yes. It suggests they connect the reflection to their own physical self.
That's amazing. So it's not just primates.
Nope. And researchers like David DeGrazia talk about different types of animal self-awareness, like basic bodily awareness, social awareness in group animals, maybe even some level of introspection awareness of internal states in certain species.
Wow. That magpie finding is really something. Scratching at a mark on their neck only when they see it in the mirror.
Yeah, pretty compelling evidence for birds.
Mind-blowing. Okay, last topic area. Back to humans. What happens when self-awareness goes wrong? When it's impaired?
Yeah, there are conditions where self-awareness is significantly affected. A key one is anosognosia.
Anosognosia.
It's basically a lack of awareness of your own deficits. Someone might be blind but not realize they're blind, or have paralysis but not be aware of it. It can happen after brain injuries, stroke, or in conditions like Alzheimer's.
Wow. That must make treatment incredibly difficult.
Hugely. If you don't think there's a problem, why would you accept help or therapy? It really impacts adherence and safety.
I can imagine. Are there other examples?
Well, there's ongoing research into self-awareness in autism spectrum disorder. Some findings suggest differences in the neural processing of self-related information. And in schizophrenia, impaired awareness of cognitive difficulties is often part of the condition.
So understanding these impairments is clinically important too.
Definitely. It's not just about personal growth. It's crucial for diagnosis, treatment, and supporting people with these conditions.
Well, this has been quite the journey. We've gone from Reddit comments to brain scans to magpies looking in mirrors, all trying to unpack self-awareness and self-consciousness.
We really have covered a lot of ground, and hopefully the core distinction is clearer now. Self-awareness is that inward journey, understanding your inner landscape.
While self-consciousness is more tangled up with that feeling of being watched, how you think others see you.
Exactly. And both sit within that even bigger idea of consciousness, potentially connecting us to something larger than just ourselves.
And the really key thing, I think, is that self-awareness isn't something you either have or don't. It's a skill, a process you can cultivate.
Absolutely. It's a journey, not a destination. And those practical steps we discussed, breath work, journaling, reflection, they're tools for that ongoing journey.
So a final thought to leave our listeners with.
Maybe this. Think about how self-awareness unfolds in a child, and how even some animals show signs of self-recognition. What does that tell us about consciousness more broadly, and maybe our own place in the world? And for you personally, right now, which aspect feels more relevant? Deepening that inner understanding, or maybe navigating that awareness of how you're perceived? Just something to ponder.
Great food for thought. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next exploration.